My name is Donna, a 30-something woman whose life had been a roller coaster of highs and lows. I had always considered myself practical and somewhat skeptical, especially when it came to matters of the heart. However, all that changed 8 years ago when I met Rick at a mutual friend's party. From the moment I saw him across the room, I knew my life was about to change. His smile was magnetic. His eyes sparkled with kindness, and there was an inexplicable sense of warmth and comfort that enveloped me whenever we spoke. We started dating, and before long, we knew we were meant to be together. "Can you believe this is happening?" Rick asked me one night, a week before our wedding. We were sitting on our favorite bench overlooking the river, the place where he'd proposed. "I know. It's surreal, but it's the best kind of surreal," I replied, looking into his eyes. Rick smiled. "You make me incredibly happy, Donna. And you make me feel like the luckiest woman in the world," I said as we both sealed that affirmation with a kiss. We had the kind of relationship that people write novels about, dream about, and sometimes even envy. We were best friends, soulmates, and life partners. The connection we shared was pure and intense, a love that I had never felt before. We supported each other through thick and thin, celebrated each other's victories, and stood by each other during life's toughest moments. When we decided to get married, it felt like the most natural progression of our relationship. We couldn't imagine spending our lives with anyone else. Our wedding was a dream come true. A day of unfiltered joy, love, and an affirmation of the commitment we shared. I walked down the aisle with my father by my side towards a beaming Rick. Our friends and family surrounded us, their faces flushed with happiness for us. It was a day that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, except for one person, Sarah, Rick's sister. Sarah had always been a challenge for me. From the day we were introduced, she maintained an attitude that was less than welcoming. The first time I met her was at a family dinner at Rick's parents' house. "Donna, this is my sister Sarah," Rick had introduced, his voice tinged with a bit of apprehension. "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand. She gave me a limp handshake and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Likewise," she responded, but her tone suggested anything but. She sized me up and down as if evaluating whether I was worthy of her brother, and her verdict was clear in her dismissive attitude. I felt it again on our wedding day. She had a scowl that was impossible to miss. When I hugged her during the reception, her reciprocation was half-hearted at best. "You look beautiful, Donna. Rick made a good choice," she said, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be joining your family," I replied, trying to ignore the undercurrent of tension. "Well, as long as my brother is happy," she said, her words laden with a meaning she didn't bother to disguise. That's the story of how I became Donna, Rick's wife, living a blissful married life despite the one lingering dark cloud that was his sister Sarah. However, I always thought that love would be enough to conquer any obstacle, even a difficult sister. In-law, I couldn't have been more wrong, and it would take years and a heart-wrenching loss to truly understand that. If I had to describe the 8 years Rick and I spent together in marriage, I'd unequivocally call them a fairy tale. Every day felt like a blessing, a gift wrapped in love and shared dreams. We were both career-oriented. Rick worked in finance, crunching numbers and analyzing market trends, while I was deeply engrossed in the world of marketing. Our jobs were demanding, yet we managed to carve out a life that was rich in love and companionship. Weekends were our sanctuary. Whether it was cuddling on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a movie, or taking spontaneous road trips to small towns we had never heard of, we always made sure to prioritize us. We had a ritual. Every Sunday night, we would sit on our backyard patio, sipping wine, and talk about everything and nothing at all. "Can you believe it's been 5 years already?" Rick asked one such evening, swirling his wine glass and looking contemplative. "5 years of pure magic," I said, raising my glass for a toast. "To us, and many more years of happiness," he agreed, clinking his glass against mine. We laughed, we loved, and we shared the kind of intimacy that was as rare as it was beautiful. We were comfortable enough to be ourselves around each other, our flawed, imperfect, real selves. Rick was my confidant, my sounding board, and most importantly, my best friend. When I was stressed about a big campaign at work, he was there to listen and offer advice. "Donna, you've got this. You're the best at what you do," he'd reassure me. "I don't know. This campaign is really high stakes. What if I mess it up?" I'd reply, plagued by professional insecurities. "You won't. And even if something goes wrong, we'll figure it out." Together, Rick would say, and that assurance would give me the courage to face anything. In those 8 years, we made the choice not to have children, despite societal and familial pressures. It wasn't a decision we took lightly, but we were both content with our life the way it was. We had each other, and that was enough for us. Family gatherings, on the other hand, were a different story. While we were deeply loved and supported by both our families, Sarah was the only discordant note in our symphony of happiness. I tried my best to understand her, to extend an olive branch, to build some form of relationship for the sake of Rick, but it was a futile endeavor. Her behavior ranged from overtly passive, aggressive, to downright disdainful. At family events, she often made snide comments and insinuations designed to belittle me. "So Donna, another year and still no kids. You do know you're not getting any younger," she'd quip during a family dinner. "We're happy with our choices, Sarah." Rick would intervene, his voice tinged with irritation. Despite Sarah's continuous attempts to sour our happiness, Rick and I remained unshakable. We had built a life based on mutual respect, trust, and a love so profound that no outside negativity could taint it. Even when Rick was diagnosed with cancer, our bond only strengthened. We faced the looming uncertainty with courage, and although we were frightened, we were united in our struggle. It was this unity, this incredible bond, that made the life we had so special. We were each other's sanctuary, and even amidst life's challenges, we found peace and solace in the love we shared. Looking back, I realize how rare and precious those years were. An oasis of happiness in a world that was often chaotic and unforgiving. And that makes what happened later even more heartbreaking. Rick's passing left an unimaginable void in my life, like a gaping wound that never seemed to heal. I took solace in my work, tried to get involved in social activities, and even joined a grief support group. Yet, I found myself aching for his presence, missing the comfort and warmth he brought into my life. Just when I thought the isolation was becoming unbearable, life threw me another curveball. Sarah. It was a chilly evening when she showed up at my doorstep with her son Timmy, her face etched with worry and defeat. The woman who had always walked with her nose in the air seemed to have been humbled by life's circumstances. She had lost her job and, with it, her financial independence. As much as I disliked her, I couldn't deny the sadness that filled her eyes. "Donna, I don't know how to say this, but we need a place to stay," Sarah mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "I've lost my job and finding a new one is taking longer than I expected." I looked at her, then at Timmy, who clung to his mother's leg, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. My heart wavered. I thought about Rick, how much he loved his sister despite her flaws, and how he would have wanted me to extend help in a time like this. "Come in," I finally said, stepping aside to let them enter. "We'll figure something out." Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that evening. "Thank you," she whispered, and I could sense a hint of genuine gratitude. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Sarah and Timmy became a part of my daily life. I set up the guest room for them, turning it into a space where they could feel at home. I also made it clear that this arrangement was temporary, at least until Sarah found a job and could support herself and Timmy. Despite my reservations, I tried to make the living situation as comfortable as possible for all of us. I included them in meals, made room for Timmy's toys in the living area, and even compromised my privacy to a great extent. All of this was financed by my savings and my current income. Sarah contributed nothing but did little to curb her extravagant lifestyle. "How did your job interview go?" I'd ask during dinner, trying to be supportive. "It was okay. They said they'll call," Sarah would reply, scrolling through her phone without even making eye contact. "And Timmy, how was school today?" I'd make an effort to include him in the conversation. "It was good," he'd respond, mirroring his mother's disinterest. Living with Sarah was taxing. She continued to show no appreciation for the sacrifices I was making, both financial and emotional. While I tried to keep an atmosphere of harmony for Timmy's sake, the tension was palpable. Sarah lived on my money, made no effort to expedite her job search, and still carried the same dismissive attitude toward me that she had always had. I told myself repeatedly, this is for Rick. This is what he would wanted. Yet, deep inside, resentment brewed. Still, I held on, believing that family obligations and the memory of Rick would see me through this challenging period. But as days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was taking advantage of my generosity and goodwill. And then came the day of my father's funeral, a day that would serve as the final straw in a steadily deteriorating relationship. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, living with Sarah became an ordeal that I hadn't fully anticipated. On the surface, she was civil enough, performing basic chores, occasionally cooking meals, and largely keeping to herself. But it was the undercurrents, the nuances in her behavior that revealed her real feelings. She acted like a guest who had overstayed her welcome yet felt entitled to stay even longer. Our household dynamic became increasingly strained. Sarah took little initiative to find employment. She had interviews lined up but never seemed excited or hopeful about any of them. She'd spend hours on her phone, scrolling through social media or indulging in online shopping. Actions that irked me, considering the financial burden of sustaining her and her son fell entirely on me. "So, any news from the job front?" I'd ask during one of our painfully awkward dinner conversations. "They said they'd get back to me next week. But who knows?" Sarah would say dismissively, a note of cynicism coloring her words. "Do you need help with your resume or maybe practicing for interviews?" I offered one day, attempting to be constructive and proactive about her job search. "I think I can manage," she retorted, her tone icy and uninviting. The tension was impossible to ignore. I was no longer living in my own home. It felt like I was a guest in a space commandeered by Sarah. She treated my generosity as a given, something she was entitled to. The audacity of her behavior became clear in subtle ways. She'd invite friends over without asking for my permission, use my car without telling me, and often decide the dinner menu based on her preferences, disregarding mine completely. Despite the emotional turmoil, I felt bound by the memory of Rick. He would have wanted me to take care of his family. I kept reminding myself, but deep down I began questioning the validity of that obligation. Was Rick's love and our shared memories a blanket license for his sister to exploit my goodwill? This period was also emotionally taxing for me as I was still grieving Rick, missing the life we'd built together. I yearned for his wisdom and comfort, especially when things got tough with Sarah. Each time she acted out or showed ingratitude, I found myself talking to Rick in my mind. What would you do? How should I handle this? And each time I was met with silence, an agonizing reminder of my solitude. To add insult to injury, Sarah began imposing her opinions on how I should live my life as a widow. She made snide comments about me still wearing my wedding ring and criticized me for holding on to Rick's belongings. "Don't you think it's time to move on? Keeping all these things around isn't healthy," she remarked one afternoon. "Whether or not I move on is my decision to make, not yours," I snapped back, losing my patience. In retrospect, that was the moment I realized my threshold was being tested to its limit. Each day became a battle to protect my space, my peace, and my memories of Rick. The line had to be drawn somewhere, but I wasn't sure when or how, until fate stepped in and made the decision for me. The day of my father's funeral was emotionally draining, a whirlpool of grief, memories, and farewells. Losing another pillar of my life so soon after Rick felt like a cruel joke that fate was playing on me. My emotional reserves were already running low, and the ceremonial duties, condolences, and well wishes only exhausted me further. Just when I thought I couldn't take anymore, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Hey, can you come home soon? I have a manicure appointment, and I'm already late." Her voice rang through the phone. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. The audacity, the insensitivity. Did she not understand the gravity of the day I was going through? "Sarah, I'm at my father's funeral," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Well, yeah, but can you hurry?" "I really need to go," she said, her tone devoid of any empathy or understanding. That was the breaking point. The moment those words left her mouth, something inside me snapped. All the pent-up anger, the frustration, the resentment that had been simmering under the surface boiled over. This was not just another inconvenience or disrespectful act. This was a slap in the face, a stark realization that Sarah had no regard for me as a person, as a family member, or even as a human being dealing with loss. I hung up without a word, a mix of disbelief and clarity washing over me. The fog of obligation and guilt that had clouded my judgment for months finally lifted, replaced by an assertive resolve. It was high time for me to reclaim my space, my dignity, and my life. As soon as the funeral proceedings were over, I drove home, each mile adding to my determination. I walked in to find Sarah lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone as Timmy played with his toys. The house that was once a sanctuary with Rick had turned into a battlefield, and it was time to end the war. "Sarah, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm but measured. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. "About what?" "About you leaving. Pack your things. You can't stay here any longer," I said. She laughed incredulously. "You can't be serious. I'm Rick's sister. He would never have kicked me out." "I loved Rick, not you. And my obligation to you ended when you showed zero respect for me or for the serious events in my life," I retorted. "I have a child, Donna. Where will we go?" she asked, finally showing a hint of desperation. "That's something you should have thought about before taking advantage of my generosity. You have a week to figure it out," I said, putting an end to the discussion. As I walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was as if I had finally stood up for myself, for the life Rick and I had built, and for the principles that mattered to me. It wasn't just about reclaiming my home. It was about reclaiming my life and my sense of self. It was not an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. A line drawn in the sand to protect my well-being. Sarah did leave, with as much drama as she had lived under my roof, but that's a story for another day. What mattered was that I had finally broken free from the toxic cycle of guilt and obligation. And in that newfound freedom, I found peace, a silence that was both liberating and empowering. It was the end of an exhausting chapter, but also the beginning of a new journey for me, one that I could navigate on my own terms. The week following my ultimatum to Sarah was a tense one. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, each moment saturated with unspoken animosity. She had begun to pack her belongings, but not without attempting to make me feel guilty for my decision at every turn. "You're going to regret this, Donna," she'd say as she folded her clothes into boxes. "Rick would have never approved of you treating his family like this." "That's where you're wrong," I replied, standing my ground. "Rick would never have approved of the way you've been treating me." Despite the hostility, I felt an underlying sense of relief. I was standing up for myself, reclaiming the boundaries that should have been respected all along. The confrontation was inevitable, yet necessary. I couldn't continue sacrificing my well-being for someone who showed blatant disregard for my feelings and circumstances. On the last day, Sarah requested to talk. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation that didn't involve her needs or wants. I obliged, curious to hear what she had to say. We sat in the living room, the same space that had hosted happier times with Rick, now turned into an arena of confrontation. "I just want you to know that you're making a huge mistake," Sarah began, her eyes piercing into mine. "But fine, we'll leave. Just don't expect me to ever come around for holidays or family gatherings. That's a choice you're making, Sarah. My door was always open until you abused that hospitality," I countered. "Don't put this on me," she snapped. "You're the one who's tossing me and my son out. I gave you shelter, food, and time to sort yourself out, all while grieving the loss of my husband and my father," I retorted. "And what did I get in return? Disrespect and entitlement." Sarah shook her head as if dismissing my feelings entirely. "You're just looking for reasons to victimize yourself." "You're missing the point, Sarah," I continued, maintaining my composure. "This isn't about playing the victim. It's about setting boundaries. You're Rick's sister, and for that reason alone, I extended help when you needed it most. But family ties are not a free pass for you to trample over me." Silence enveloped the room. Sarah looked at me, perhaps for the first time, as someone who wasn't just an extension of her brother, but as an individual with feelings and boundaries. Whether she understood or agreed was unclear, but she finally seemed to grasp the gravity of her actions. "You'll regret this," she mumbled, standing up. Maybe not," I said, "but I'd rather live with that regret than continue living like this." As Sarah walked away, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and trepidation about what lay ahead, but more than anything, I felt a newfound respect for myself. This confrontation was more than just a disagreement. It was a reclamation of my space, my sanity, and my life. For the first time in months, I felt like the master of my own fate, unburdened by the toxic guilt and obligation that had shackled me for so long. It was the end of a painful chapter, but also a hopeful beginning, one that I knew Rick would have wanted for me, filled with self-respect, boundaries, and the courage to stand up for myself. Life post, Sarah was like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into daylight. The quiet solitude that I had once dreaded became a sanctuary of peace and reflection. The empty spaces in my home, once filled with tension and hostility, slowly turned back into corners of comfort and tranquility. The absence of her abrasive presence was like lifting a heavy weight off my chest. The first few days felt strange, as if I was waiting for the next conflict, the next argument. It took a while for me to accept that the storm had indeed passed. I found myself reclaiming my home one step at a time, redecorating rooms and reclaiming spaces that had been compromised during her stay. Even small things like cooking my favorite meals or binge-watching shows I liked became acts of reclaiming my independence. Soon after Sarah's departure, I received a call from Karen, a mutual friend who was more on Sarah's side of the fence, but knew both of us well. "Donna, how could you kick Sarah out? She's family, and she has a child," Karen exclaimed as soon as I picked up the phone. "Karen, you know I'm not one to make rash decisions," I began. I tolerated as much as I could. She was disrespectful and ungrateful even during the most trying times in my life. "So, you've decided to just cut her off, just like that?" Karen persisted. "Yes, just like that," I said firmly. "Sometimes you have to choose your own well-being over toxic family bonds. I don't expect everyone to understand, but it was something I had to do for myself." Karen sighed. "All right, I can't say I fully understand, but it's your life." "Exactly, it's my life," I responded. "And for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm living it on my terms." Conversations like these were difficult but necessary. They made me realize that not everyone would understand or support my decision. But that was okay. The confrontation with Sarah had taught me the importance of setting boundaries, even if it meant facing judgment or misunderstanding from others. As weeks turned into months, I found myself diving back into the world I had temporarily put on hold. I returned to my job with renewed vigor, reconnected with old friends, and even started a small book club, something I had always wanted to do. It wasn't just about filling the void that Rick or Sarah had left. It was about rediscovering who Donna was, what she liked, what she didn't, and what she would no longer tolerate. And just like that, life moved on. There were still moments when I missed Rick terribly or found myself second, guessing my decisions. But each day brought its own lessons, its own battles, and its own